My wife looked at me and said, "Maybe we married too young." I didn't debate or convince her to stay. I simply accepted her honesty, walked away calmly, and months later, she discovered some doors closed quietly, but never opened the same way again. Maybe we married too young. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. Not crying, not yelling, not even looking at me when she said it. Just staring out the kitchen window at nothing in particular, arms crossed loosely over her chest, shoulders settled into that particular stillness that only comes after a decision has already been made. Just those 5 words, floating in the morning air of our apartment like smoke from a candle that had just been put out. I was standing maybe 6 feet away from her, coffee mug in my hand, still warm, not yet touched. And I looked at the back of her head, at the way her hair fell over one shoulder, at the small tension in her jaw that I had learned to read over 7 years together. And I didn't say anything. Not right away. I didn't pull out a chair and say, "Sit down, let's talk about this." I didn't reach across the counter and touch her hand. I didn't say the thing every person in that situation wants to hear, "You don't mean that." Because she did mean it. I could tell. And somewhere deep inside me, somewhere quiet and tired and honest, I had already known this was coming. Not the exact words, not this exact morning, but this feeling, this particular weight that had been building for a long time. So instead of arguing, I set my mug down on the counter. Slowly, no dramatic sound, no punctuation, just a mug meeting marble. I looked at the floor for a moment, and then I said, very quietly, "Okay, just that. One word." She turned around then, finally, and I saw something on her face that I genuinely hadn't expected to see. Surprise. She had clearly rehearsed for a fight. She had steeled herself for me to say, "What? No. Claire, come on. We can fix this. Tell me what's wrong." She had probably already mapped out her next 3 responses to whatever I would fire back. And instead I had handed her a single syllable and a calm face. She blinked at me. "Okay," she repeated, like she wasn't sure she'd heard me right. "Yeah," I said. "Okay." And then I picked up my coffee mug again, walked past her to the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. We were 29 years old, married for 4 years, together for 7, no kids, a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a city we'd moved to together 3 years ago for her career. That's all you need to know about the setup. Everything else will reveal itself. She came and stood in the bedroom doorway about 20 minutes later. I was still sitting on the edge of the bed. I hadn't cried. I hadn't called anyone. I had just sat there and let the reality of the moment settle into my bones like cold weather. She leaned against the door frame and looked at me the way you look at someone when you expected them to explode, and they didn't. "You're not going to say anything else?" she asked. I looked up at her. "What would you like me to say?" She shifted her weight. "I don't know. Something. Anything. You made a statement," I said. "I accepted it. What more is there?" She frowned. "That's it. For years, and that's it." I held her gaze. "You said maybe we married too young. That's not a question. That's not I want to work on this. That's not can we talk. That's a conclusion, Claire. So I'm treating it like one." She opened her mouth, closed it again. "I just meant." "I know what you meant," I said. And I stood up, walked to the closet, and started pulling out clothes to pack a bag. Not dramatically, not throwing things, just carefully, methodically, the way you pack when you've been somewhere long enough and you know the stay has ended. She watched me for a full minute without saying a word. And then she said, very quietly, "Where are you going?" "Derek's," I said. "Just for a few days. Give us both some space." She didn't stop me. And that, more than anything, told me everything I still needed to know. Derek had been my best friend since college. He had a 2-bedroom place across town and the kind of calm energy that meant he never asked too many questions at the wrong time. When I showed up at his door that Tuesday morning with a duffel bag and a flat expression, he just stepped aside to let me in, handed me a glass of water, and didn't ask a single thing. We sat on his couch and watched bad television for 3 hours. That was exactly what I needed. Later that night, after dinner, he finally asked, "How bad?" "Pretty bad," I said. He nodded. "She won out." She didn't use that word. But yeah. He was quiet for a moment. "And you?" I stared at the ceiling. "I think I've wanted out for a long time too," I said. I just didn't know how to admit it. Derek said nothing. He just refilled both our glasses. And we sat with that truth in the room until it stopped feeling so heavy. Here's what I didn't say to Derek that night. Here's what I hadn't said to anyone. The marriage had stopped feeling like a marriage about 2 years ago. Not because of a single dramatic incident. Not because of anything I could point to and say there. That's the moment. It was smaller than that. Quieter. It was the way she'd started responding to things I said at dinner parties with a tiny correction. A small adjustment to my stories. Well, actually, that's not quite how it happened. Said with a little laugh, as if I were a child who had gotten the details of a fairy tale slightly wrong. It was the way she'd stop mid-sentence when I was talking about my work and pick up her phone to reply to a message. Not rudely. Not obviously. Just enough. Just frequently enough to communicate something I was never supposed to call out directly. It was the way she'd make plans and mention them to me as afterthoughts. Oh, by the way, Vanessa and I are going to the lake house that weekend. You'll be all right here. Not, would you like to come? Not, is that okay? Just, you'll be all right. As if my role in the partnership had quietly been reclassified at some point without a meeting. There was a birthday dinner once. My 31st. She had planned something. I'll give her that. She always showed up logistically. Nice restaurant. A few friends. A gift that was well chosen, but impersonal. And partway through the evening, one of her friends said something funny, and Claire laughed, really laughed, the full laugh, head thrown back, eyes lit up, and I sat there across the table watching it and realized I couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that at something I said. Not because I had stopped being funny, but because she had stopped being present with me in the way that makes laughter possible. You can't genuinely laugh with someone you've stopped truly seeing. That was a slow truth, but it was a true one. And there was the night, about 14 months before the kitchen, when I came home genuinely excited about something at work. A project I'd been building toward for almost a year. I had been shortlisted for a lead position on something significant. The kind of thing that doesn't happen often. I came through the door, and she was on the couch with her laptop open, and I sat down next to her and said, "Something good happened today. Something I've been working toward for a long time." She closed the laptop halfway. Not all the way. Halfway. And she looked at me and said, "Oh yeah? What?" I told her. And she said, "That's great. That's really great." And then she opened the laptop again and went back to what she was doing. No questions. No tell me more. No interest in the year of groundwork that had led to that moment. I sat there on that couch for probably 4 more minutes before I got up and went to make dinner. And I didn't say anything. Because by that point, I had learned not to press for more. When you press for more from someone who isn't giving, all you get is a grudging performance of interest that somehow feels worse than the absence of it. So I stopped pressing, and she stopped noticing that I had stopped pressing, and we just lived in that. Parallel lines that occasionally intersected over meals and logistics, and the kind of weekend errands that look like a partnership from the outside. I tried to bring it up once. About 18 months before the kitchen. We were in the car, stuck in traffic, and I said, very carefully, "Sometimes I feel like we're roommates who are fond of each other. Not partners." She didn't dismiss it. She didn't get angry. She just turned and looked at me with this expression I can only describe as tired and said, "We're both busy." That's just what marriage looks like after the first year or two. And then the traffic cleared, and she turned up the radio, and we never talked about it again. That's the thing about slow erosion. Nobody notices the cliff getting shorter until there's no cliff left. And by the time you realize you've been standing on less and less ground, you're already close enough to the edge that one honest Tuesday morning conversation can tip you over. That's what her 5 words in the kitchen actually were. Not the cause. The edge. I stayed at Derek's for 5 days. During those 5 days, Claire texted me twice. Both texts were logistical. One about a bill. One about a delivery she was expecting. "No, are you okay? No, can we talk? No, I miss you." I answered both texts. Politely. 1 or 2 sentences. And then I set my phone face down on Derek's kitchen table and went for a run. I ran a lot that week. More than I had in a long time. There was something clarifying about moving my body through cold morning air while the rest of my life sat still. On the 3rd day of running, I noticed I felt lighter. Not happy. Not healed. Just lighter. Like a coat I'd been wearing for years had been lifted off my shoulders while I was looking the other way. On the 5th day, I called a real estate agent. I wasn't impulsive about it. I want to be clear about that. I didn't call the agent out of spite. I didn't do it to send a message. I did it because I had sat in Derek's guest room for 5 nights, staring at the ceiling, and the image of going back to that apartment, with its shared silences and polite exchanges, and the way she looked at me sometimes, like I was furniture that had been there so long it had become invisible. That image felt impossible. I couldn't go back to invisible. So I called. I found a small 1-bedroom. Top floor. Good light. Close to work. I put down the deposit on a Saturday. I moved in 3 weeks later. Claire and I had one real conversation in the weeks between that Tuesday morning and the day I moved my things out. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. She had asked me to come back to the apartment to collect some things, and while I was there, packing books into boxes, she sat down at the kitchen table and asked if we could talk. I pulled out a chair. I sat across from her, and she said, "I don't want you to think I don't care about you." I looked at her. "I don't think that," I said. "I just think we got together really young, and we grew up, and maybe we grew in different directions, and I don't think that's anyone's fault." I nodded slowly. That might be true, and I think if we'd met now, at 29, instead of at 22, things might have been different. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Or maybe they would have been exactly the same." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said carefully, "that I don't think our problem was age. I think our problem was that somewhere in the last 2 years, you stopped treating me like a person you chose. And I stayed anyway, and told myself it was just the rhythm of a long marriage. And we both just kept performing the version of us that looked functional from the outside." She stared at me. "That's not fair." "I'm not saying it to be unfair," I said. "I'm saying it because I think you deserve a real answer. You said maybe we married too young. And maybe that's the easier version of the story, but I don't think it's the full one." She looked down at the table. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then she said, very quietly, "I didn't realize you felt that way." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you say something?" "I tried once. In the car. You turned up the radio." She closed her eyes. "And I picked up my box of books. And I walked to the door. And I said, 'I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Claire.' I mean that sincerely. And then I left. No slammed door. No final look over my shoulder. Just a door that clicked shut behind me. Quietly. The new apartment felt enormous at first. Not because it was large, it was small, actually. But because I had become so accustomed to sharing space with someone that an entire apartment just for me felt like too much room for one person. I used to wake up at night sometimes, in those first 2 weeks, reaching across to the other side of the bed out of pure muscle memory. And when I found nothing there, I would lie on my back and stare at the ceiling until my heart settled. I'm not going to pretend those first nights were easy. They weren't. There is something specifically lonely about a new place. Not the comfortable loneliness of someone who chose solitude, but the disorienting kind that comes from having a routine suddenly removed. I would sit down to eat dinner and realize there was no one to talk to. Not that we'd had the most enlivening dinners near the end, but there is a difference between silence shared and silence alone. And I felt that difference sharply in those first 2 weeks. But here's the thing about discomfort. If you don't run from it, if you just sit with it and let it be what it is, it transforms. Not quickly, not all at once, but it shifts. The silence started feeling less like absence and more like space. Like a room that has been cleared out and can now be arranged however I chose. I didn't cry much. That surprised me. I had expected to be wrecked. I had expected the kind of grief that bends you double. Instead, there was just this low, steady ache. Manageable. Like a bruise that hurt when you pressed it, but didn't stop you from moving. I started cooking again. Properly cooking. Not just reheating things. Not just eating whatever was quick. I'd cook actual meals on Sunday evenings. I'd put music on. The kind of music she had always turned down at parties because she found it too loud or too niche or too something. And I'd stand at the stove in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, making food I actually wanted to eat, listening to music I actually wanted to hear. And sometimes I'd stand there and feel something I hadn't felt inside that apartment on the other side of the city in a very long time. Something that took me weeks to properly name. Peace. Not the peace of having fixed something. Not the peace that comes after a problem is solved. But the kind that exists when the constant low-grade friction of being slightly wrong in your own life has been removed. Like taking off shoes that have been a half size too small for 3 years. You don't fully realize how much they were hurting until they're off. And then you never want to put them back on. There was a Tuesday evening, maybe 3 weeks into the new apartment, when I went for a walk after dinner. Just a walk. No destination. And I ended up at this little park I'd noticed on my way to the grocery store. Small park. A few benches. Good trees. The kind of place you only find by wandering. I sat on a bench and watched the light go out of the sky slowly. And I thought, when was the last time I did something with no purpose except to be present? I couldn't remember. That was when I understood that the grief wasn't going to hollow me out. Because the grief and the relief were the same feeling. They were both just the truth of the situation finally being allowed to breathe. And the truth was, I was going to be okay. Not eventually. Now. Already. The hard part wasn't ahead of me. The hard part was the years I'd spent shrinking slowly without noticing. This part, this open, quiet, slightly uncomfortable freedom, this was the part where I got to grow back. Mutual friends started calling around the fourth week. Most of them meant well. One of them, a guy named Qley who'd known both of us since the early days, called me on a Wednesday night, and I could hear the careful way he was choosing his words. "So, how are you holding up?" "Good, actually," I said. Long pause. "Really?" "Yeah, really." Another pause. She seems fine too," he offered, like he was waiting to see if that would sting me. "Good," I said. "I'm glad. She's been going out more. Vanessa's group." "That's good. She should." Qley was quiet for a second. "You're not." "Not what?" "Bothered." I thought about that honestly. I think I was bothered for a long time before this happened, I said. Now I'm just free. He didn't know what to do with that. I didn't blame him. Most people expect the person who gets left to be the one who falls apart. When they don't, it confuses the script. The divorce paperwork was filed on a Thursday. I had been living in my new apartment for about 6 weeks. We had agreed on things quietly, through lawyers who were communicating politely and efficiently. No war, no accusations, no hauling each other over coals in a courtroom over furniture. Just two people untangling a life they had built together, carefully, with a minimum of additional damage. My lawyer told me I was one of the calmest clients she'd ever had in a dissolution case. I told her I had already done the grieving. I just hadn't realized I was doing it at the time. I found out through Qley, about 2 months after I moved out, that Claire was seeing someone. A guy she'd met through her work circle. His name was apparently Brendan. Mid-30s. Worked in finance. Tall. Qley told me all of this with the careful delivery of someone defusing a bomb, watching my face for the explosion. I nodded. Okay, I said. Qley stared at me. That's it. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something human. I smiled at that. I hope she's happy, I said. And I meant it. Not performatively. Not in that hollow way people say things they know sound right. I genuinely meant it. Because I had come to understand something in those weeks of long runs and quiet evenings and meals I cooked for myself with music playing. Something important. Her happiness was not my loss. Her finding something good was not a verdict on my worth. We had wanted different things for a long time. Maybe we always had. And that was nobody's crime. Here is where the story takes a turn. Not a dramatic one. Not a sudden reversal. Just a quiet shift. The kind that you only understand fully once you're standing on the other side of it. About 4 months after that Tuesday morning in the kitchen, I started to put myself back together in ways I hadn't anticipated. I went back to a hobby I had quietly abandoned 3 years into the marriage, woodworking. I'd had a small setup in the garage of our first apartment before we moved to the city. I'd left it behind because there was no space in the new place, and because every time I'd bring it up, she'd have a reason why it wasn't practical. Too messy. Too much noise. Too much stuff everywhere. So I stopped. And I forgot, slowly, that it was something I loved. I rented a small workshop space near my office. 2 evenings a week, I'd go there after work. I'd build things. A small side table at first. I remember the first time I stood back and looked at the finished thing, this modest little side table with clean joints and smooth edges, and felt something so disproportionately large for what it was. It was just a table, but I had made it. With my hands. Out of nothing. And it existed now. Permanently. There was a kind of dignity in that. In making something real. Something that didn't require anyone else's approval or notice to have value. Then a bookshelf. Then, for a friend who was getting married, a hand-finished wooden box with their initials cut into the lid. When I handed it over at the wedding, his face did something that meant more to me than almost anything that had happened in the previous year. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his thumb along the grain. And he said, "You made this?" "Yeah," I said. He looked at me. "How long have you been doing this?" I thought about how to answer that. "A long time," I said. "I just forgot for a while. I started sleeping 8 hours a night. Not lying in bed for 8 hours. Actually sleeping. Deeply. The kind of sleep that used to be common and had become rare somewhere in the middle years of the marriage. Those years when you're not fighting, but you're not quite at peace either. And your body knows the difference even when your mind has trained itself not to. I started calling my parents more. My mother cried the first time I called her after the separation because she thought I'd be devastated. Instead, I talked to her for an hour about normal things. About work. About the woodworking. About a documentary I'd watched. She kept waiting for me to break. I didn't break. By the end of the call, she said, "You sound different." Good different, or bad different? I asked. She paused. Like yourself, she said. Like the version of you I remember before. She trailed off. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I knew which version she meant. The one who laughed easily. The one who had opinions and shared them without calibrating first. The one who didn't edit himself before he spoke. That version had been there all along. He had just been folded up small and tucked somewhere quiet for safekeeping. Now he was getting back out, straightening up, taking up space again, remembering that taking up space was not a crime. The first time Claire reached out, not about logistics, not through lawyers, but personally, was 4.5 months after that Tuesday. A text message. Simple. Hey, how are you doing? Hope you're okay. I stared at it for a while. I didn't feel the pull I might have expected to feel. No spike of hope. No quiet collapse of carefully rebuilt walls. Just a kind of neutral curiosity. I replied, doing well actually. Hope you are too. She responded within a minute. That's good to hear. Then, I heard you've been getting into woodworking again. I smiled at my phone. Cole, I thought. The man was a human telegraph wire. Yeah, I wrote back. Picked it back up. It's been good. You always loved that, she wrote. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, I'm glad you have it again. I put my phone down and went to make dinner. The second time she reached out was 2 weeks later. A phone call this time. I almost didn't answer. Not because I was avoiding her, but because I was in the middle of sanding a piece of timber and I had music going and I was in that particular zone of focus that feels like the closest thing I know to meditation. But I answered. Hey, she said. Hey, is this a bad time? No. Give me a second. I set down the sandpaper. Turned the music down. Okay, what's up? A pause. I just wanted to hear your voice, she said. I didn't say anything for a moment. Claire. I know, she said quickly. I know. I'm not calling to. I'm not trying to complicate anything. I've been thinking about some things. Okay. Another pause. You were right, she said. About what you said that day? In the apartment. When you were packing up. I waited. About the radio, she said. I closed my eyes. Claire. You tried to tell me. And I turned up the radio. And I have been thinking about that one specific moment for months. Because I think that's when it was actually over. Not when I said what I said in the kitchen, but that day in the car. When I turned up the radio instead of listening to you. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the honest thing. Yeah, maybe. I'm sorry, she said. I know. Does that mean anything to you? Hearing that, I thought about it. Really thought about it. Not for the sake of her feelings, but for the sake of honesty. It means something, I said. Yes. It helps, actually, to hear you say it. But, she said. And that was the interesting thing about Claire. Even now, she could still hear a, but I hadn't said out loud yet. But it doesn't change anything, I said. Long silence. I know, she finally said. Okay. Okay, she echoed. And then, after a moment, you sound good. Different but good. Happy even. I think I am, I said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something sadder than a laugh. I'm glad, she said. And I believed her. I want to pause here and be honest about something. Because this is the part of the story that's easy to get wrong. It would be satisfying, in that bitter, vindicating way, to say that I became deeply happy entirely because she was struggling. That I rebuilt myself as a direct reaction to her. That her calling me and saying she was sorry was the dramatic pivot point where I stood tall and she realized what she'd lost. That's a clean story. That's the story that gets cheered. But that's not quite how it actually happened. The truth is messy and, I think, more useful. I wasn't happy because she was having a hard time. I was happy because I had finally stopped waiting for someone else's appraisal to determine my worth. That's the thing nobody tells you about being in a relationship where you've slowly become invisible. You don't notice it happening because it's gradual. 1 degree at a time. 1 small dismissal. 1 interruption. 1 phone picked up mid-sentence. 1 lamp turned down so slowly you don't realize the room has gotten dark until you can barely see your own hands. I had spent a long time, years, honestly, in a relationship where I had slowly stopped feeling like I mattered. Not because she hated me. Not because she was a villain in this story. She wasn't. She was a person who had fallen out of love and hadn't been brave enough to examine why or honest enough to address it directly. And I was a person who had felt that distance and chosen silence over confrontation. Because I told myself it was just the season of a long marriage. Because I told myself all couples go through this. Because fighting for something that no longer wanted to be fought for seemed more dignified than admitting it was already gone. We were both doing a disservice to each other. Me, for a feeling of being faintly invisible. Her, for a relationship that no longer challenged or excited her. And when she said, maybe we married too young, she wasn't wrong, exactly. She was just diagnosing the wrong cause. We didn't fail because we were young. We failed because we didn't protect the thing we built. We failed because when it started showing cracks, when I said, we're like roommates, and she turned up the radio, neither of us picked up the tools to repair it. We just walked past the cracks every day until the floor gave out. And once I understood that, I stopped feeling like the victim of the story. I started feeling like someone who had simply learned something important the hard way at 29. Which is, honestly, not the worst time to learn it. Some people spend their entire 30s in the same slow erosion before they finally admit what they're standing in. I got out while I still had decades ahead of me to build something real. That thought, once it landed, was not sad. It was the furthest thing from sad. It was fuel. 6 months after that Tuesday in the kitchen, the divorce was finalized. I signed the paperwork in a room that smelled like old carpet and printer ink. My lawyer shook my hand. I walked outside. It was a clear afternoon. The light was doing that particular autumn thing where everything looks slightly golden. And I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, hands in my pockets, and I looked up at the sky. I had expected to feel something enormous. Some profound, sweeping emotion worthy of the occasion. 7 years of a relationship. 4 years of a marriage. Officially, legally, permanently over. But what I felt was, not happy, not sad. Just present. Just real. Like someone who had been moving through fog for a long time and had stepped out into open air. Like the world had a texture to it that I had forgotten was there. I could hear traffic. I could feel the cold of the air in my lungs. I could see the clouds moving against a pale sky. Everything felt exact and vivid and immediate. I called my mother on the walk home. She asked how it went. Clean, I said. She started to say something emotional. I said, Mom, I'm okay. I promise. She believed me this time. And that evening, I went to the workshop. I spent 3 hours working on a commission piece. A small cabinet for a woman who had found me through the friend whose wedding box I'd made. And I worked quietly, in the particular rhythm that woodworking gives you. Measure, mark, cut, fit, adjust, and at some point I realized I was humming. Not a song I could name. Just the sound my body was making because it was content. That was worth more to me than any piece of paper signed in a room that smelled like old carpet. That hum in the quiet of a workshop. After the day, I closed one chapter of my life. That was the real marker. That was when I knew I hadn't just survived something. I had come out the other side with something I hadn't expected to find. Myself. Intact. Undimmed. I heard through Qley, a few weeks later, that things with Brendan hadn't worked out. I didn't ask for details. Qley offered them anyway, because Qley is constitutionally incapable of withholding information. It had fizzled, apparently. Something about their lifestyles not matching up. Or a trip that hadn't gone well. Or something about the way he talked over her at dinner. I don't actually know the specifics and didn't try to. What I noticed in myself when Qley told me was the same quiet neutrality I had felt before. No satisfaction. No told you so. Just, okay. That's life. Things don't always work. People figure things out. The third time Claire reached out was different from the first two. It was a Sunday. I remember that. I was at the workshop space, working on a piece for a client, a commission, actually, my first paid one, which felt like a small milestone. She texted and asked if I was free to meet for coffee sometime that week. She said, nothing heavy. I just think it would be good to talk. For real. I sat with the text for about an hour. And then I wrote back, sure. Thursday works. We met at a place near her office. Neutral ground. Neither of our apartments. She was already there when I arrived. Sitting by the window. She looked good, but different from how she'd looked during our marriage. Less polished, maybe. More herself. She had a coffee already and she ordered me one before I sat down, because she still remembered how I took it, and something about that small detail hit me in a way I didn't expect. We made small talk for a few minutes. Work. Friends. The city. Normal, careful, coffee shop conversation. And then she put her mug down and looked at me directly and said, "Are you seeing anyone?" "No," I said. "Not yet." "Not yet," she repeated, like she was tasting the words. I looked at her. "You?" She shook her head. "No, the thing with Brendan." "You don't have to explain," I said. "I want to," she said, "because I think it taught me something." I waited. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I think I was so focused on the idea that something was missing in our marriage that I didn't stop to actually examine what it was. And when I started seeing him, I realized the things I thought I was missing. They weren't about you. They were about me. Things I needed to figure out on my own. That had nothing to do with age, or marrying young, or any of that. I looked at her. That's a big thing to realize, I said. Yeah, a little too late, maybe. Maybe not too late for the next thing, I said. She looked at me, and I saw it in her face, the question she wanted to ask. The question that had probably been building through every text, every phone call, this whole coffee. Is there any chance, she said quietly, that we could? No, I said. Not harshly, not coldly, just clearly. She nodded slowly. She had expected it. I could tell. Can I ask why? And not because I'm trying to change your mind. I want to understand. I thought about it. I owed her the real answer. Because I spent a long time in that apartment feeling like I was getting smaller, I said. Not because of anything dramatic. Just slowly, quietly. And I didn't realize how small I'd gotten until I left. And now I'm getting bigger again. And I think going back would undo that. Not because I blame you, but because some things, once they've been allowed to erode, can't be rebuilt into the same shape. She had tears in her eyes. Not dramatic, falling tears. Just the quiet kind that sit on the edge and stay there. I really am sorry, she said. For the radio. And everything the radio stood for. I know, I said. You're going to be really good, she said. Whoever you end up with. She's going to be very lucky. I smiled at that. You too, I said. When you're ready. We finished our coffees. We hugged outside on the sidewalk. It was a real hug. Long and honest. The kind that says, I loved you. I still have some love for you. And this is also goodbye. She walked one direction. I walked the other. And that was that. I want to tell you something about the months that followed. Because this is the part that people don't usually include in these kinds of stories. The part after the resolution. After the coffee shop goodbye. After the papers are signed. People usually end the story there, with the closing of the door and the implication that everything is either wonderful or terrible going forward. But real life doesn't cut to black. It keeps going. And what kept going for me was ordinary and surprisingly good. I got better at woodworking. The client commission led to 2 more. Small things, mostly. Furniture for people who appreciated that something was made by hand. There's something about working with your hands that I can't quite explain unless you've experienced it. It roots you. Makes you feel like you exist in 3 dimensions. Makes abstract problems feel less abstract. I ran a half marathon in the spring. Didn't train as seriously as I should have. Finished anyway. Felt terrible for 4 days afterward. Felt great for weeks after that. I started actually calling people, friends I'd let drift during the years when the marriage was the center of gravity. Old college friends. A cousin I'd been meaning to visit for 2 years. A mentor from my early career who I'd always respected but slowly lost contact with. It's strange how many connections a person lets atrophy when they're busy managing something that isn't working. Like all your emotional energy is being used up in one place. And when that place empties out, you discover there are all these other rooms in your life that you forgot were there. There is one more part of this story. I almost didn't include it, but it matters. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, so a little over a year after that Tuesday morning in the kitchen, I met someone. I wasn't looking. That's not a cliche. I mean it literally. I was at a bookshop on a Saturday, browsing nothing in particular. Just one of those Saturday afternoons with no agenda and good light coming through the windows. The kind of afternoon that only belongs to people who have stopped filling every hour with noise. She was trying to reach a book on the top shelf and couldn't quite get to it. She was standing on her toes, one hand braced against the shelf, one hand reaching, and there was something about the determined way she was going for it, refusing to ask for help, refusing to give up, that made me smile before I even saw her face. I reached it for her without being asked. She turned around, book in hand, and looked at me. Thanks, she said. What is it? I asked, nodding at the book. She turned it over to show me the cover. It was something I'd read years ago. I said, that one's good. The middle drags a little, but the ending is worth it. She raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of convincing me to buy it? More like informed consent, I said. She laughed. A real laugh. Bright and unself-conscious and entirely unbothered about whether it was appropriate for a bookshop. And that was it. That was the beginning of something. I don't want to say too much about her. It's too early and too private and too real to narrate yet. But what I will say is this. The first time we sat across from each other and really talked, I noticed I didn't feel small. I noticed I was speaking in full sentences without editing myself halfway through. I noticed she was looking at me the way that Claire had, once, at 22. Like what I was saying was worth hearing. And I thought, so this is what it's supposed to feel like. This. Not the absence of difficulty. Not the absence of effort, but the presence of someone who is genuinely interested, who turns toward you instead of away, who doesn't just tolerate the full version of you, who actually prefers it. That's rarer than people say, and it's the only thing worth building anything on. I think about Claire sometimes. Not with bitterness. Not with longing, exactly. More like the way you think about a place you used to live. A city you left for good reasons. You can remember being happy there. You can recognize what it gave you. You can wish it well. And you can also know, clearly and without doubt, that you're in the right place now. I've thought about why I walked away the way I did. Why I didn't fight. Why I didn't beg or argue or try to convince her to stay. And the honest answer is, I didn't have it in me. Not because I was defeated, but because somewhere in those years of being quietly invisible, some part of me had already begun the process of letting go. She didn't cause the end of the marriage when she said, maybe we married too young. She just said out loud what had already happened. And once it was out loud, the only dignified response I could imagine was to accept it. To hear it clearly. To say, okay. Not, okay, defeat. Not, okay, I give up. Just, okay. I hear you. I see what this is. And I will not degrade myself by turning this into a negotiation. There is something in that kind of acceptance that people mistake for passivity. They think, he just gave up. He didn't fight for his marriage. But I would ask you to consider another reading. Maybe I recognize that some fights, once they've reached a certain point, aren't really fights about saving something. They're just noise. They're just the sound of one person refusing to hear what the other person is already certain of. And making that noise doesn't save anything. It just extends the pain and costs both people their self-respect on the way out. I chose self-respect. I chose a quiet door. And I will tell you something else I've come to understand in the months since. The people in your life who see you do that, who watch you absorb a hard blow without crumbling, without retaliating, without making it everyone else's problem, those people take note. Derek took note. My mother took note. The woman in the bookshop didn't know any of this history, of course, but she was meeting the version of me that all of it had produced. And that version showed up differently, stood differently in a room, spoke without calibrating first, wasn't bracing for a small correction or a glance at a phone mid-sentence. What you go through changes you. The only question is ever which direction, toward less or toward more. I chose more. And yes, some doors, once they close quietly, don't open the same way again. That's not a punishment. That's just physics. That's just what happens when a door closes all the way, properly, with intention rather than rage. It reshapes the frame. And the next door you build has a different threshold. Higher. One you chose with clear eyes. One you stepped through without wondering if you're allowed. Because you built it. And it fits. The last time I heard from Claire was a text she sent on a Sunday evening about 4 months after our coffee shop meeting. It said, I hope you're doing really well. I started therapy. Long overdue. Wanted you to know. I smiled at my phone. That's great. I wrote back. I'm proud of you. She sent back a single emoji. A small yellow sun. And that was the last message. Simple. Clean. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself as an ending. Just a text. A sun. And then silence that feels like the right kind of silence. If I could tell one thing to the version of myself standing in that kitchen, holding a cold coffee, about to hear those 5 words, it would be this. You are allowed to hear hard things and not collapse. You are allowed to accept the truth without fighting it. You are allowed to walk away from something that stopped being good without needing permission or validation or a dramatic scene. And you are allowed to discover, on the other side of loss, that the version of yourself that was slowly disappearing, he's still there. He's been waiting. He's fine. Actually, he's better than fine. He just needed room. The other thing I'd tell him is this. When she says it, your instinct is going to be to argue. To say, that's not fair. To say, we can fix this. To say, tell me what you need and I'll be it. Don't. Not because you're giving up. Not because you don't love her. But because the man who begs to stay in a place that has already quietly decided he doesn't fit, that man never recovers his self-respect. Not fully. And your self-respect is the one thing that will serve you every single day for the rest of your life. No matter who you end up with, no matter what you build, no matter what you lose. Protect it. Not aggressively. Not coldly. Just quietly. Like a door that clicks shut on its own weight. Firm. Final. Without drama. Because the loudest endings leave the longest wreckage. And the quiet ones? The quiet ones let both people find their way forward with something left intact. That's what I chose. And I'd choose it again. Every time. The door didn't slam. It closed quietly. And that quiet click That barely audible sound of something shutting is the sound that echoed longest. Not the fight we didn't have, not the scene we didn't make, just a door clicking shut in the particular, permanent way that only happens when someone walks away with their dignity intact.